Hello everyone and welcome to week 8, Oligopoly and Game Theory. Probably my favorite week in this course, content-wise, and also the most different of all of the lectures or all of the learning activities. It's also a standalone lecture, really. But before we move into that field, we'll try to link it into what we've seen before, and as is our tradition now, we will start with a little bit of feedback to try to assimilate some of those lessons from last time. So, a multiple choice question, same format as the final exam. A childcare provider, Cubby Playhouse, can offer 30 places to children at the market price and has an increasing marginal cost curve. Children's daycare is a competitive industry, don't I know it, and is assumed to be at a long-run equilibrium position. Now suppose there is an increase in demand for daycare places. In the short run, Cubby Playhouse will be able to offer fewer than 30 places as marginal cost will be increasing, more than 30 places as marginal revenue will be increasing, equal to 30 places as both marginal cost and revenue will be increasing, or either fewer or more than 30 places as both marginal cost and revenue will be decreasing. You might have to draw some graphs for this one, both at the market and the individual firm level. Pause the video now and come up with your answer. And the correct answer is B, more than 30 places, because marginal revenue is increasing. Let's work through logically how we could have got to that answer. First, in perfect competition, following the cost-benefit principle, we know that price is equal to marginal revenue. We know that price is equal to marginal revenue in perfect competition because that's what a firm can receive from selling one more good. And of course, with marginal revenue being equal to marginal cost, that means price is equal to marginal cost. And we know that that intersection happens for Cubby Playhouse when the quantity is equal to 30. First, let's think about our market graph. We've got supply and demand, and the demand curve is moving to the right. This will lead to an increase in the market price. Now let's switch to the individual firm, in this case Cubby Playhouse. At the individual firm level, they're facing a demand curve that's perfectly horizontal because they are a price taker. And before it was perfectly horizontal at the market price, and now that price has gone up. If that price has gone up, what happens to that new intersection point with the marginal cost curve? Well, because our marginal cost curve is upward sloping, and you might have to draw this graph if you don't quite get it from me just speaking it, you might want to see it visually. If you move up the demand curve with an upward sloping marginal cost curve, that new intersection will be at a higher quantity, so further to the right along the x-axis. So that means that the new profit maximizing point will be at a point where the quantity is larger than 30 places, and so more kids can be accepted. Okay, a very quick recap from last time. You might have been scared by the large number of slides in this presentation, but you'll see most of them we can go through pretty quickly, like this recap. So we took a look at the spectrum of market structure, where we looked at markets in terms of their concentration and their competition. We focused first on perfect competition and then monopoly, which is as far away as you can get. And then we sort of tried to zero in on these two intermediate markets, monopolistic competition and oligopoly, both of which have features common to both perfect competition and monopoly. And we took a look first at monopolistic competition, the features of which were similar to perfectly competitive markets for the most part, a large number of firms, many close substitutes, and fewer barriers to entry into the market, preferably none in a theoretical sense. But those products and services could be differentiated, such as different types of cafes in Brisbane, for example, which gives the firms some pricing power. And that pricing power gives it this feature that's similar to monopoly in that there's a downward sloping demand curve. On the other hand, it has an equilibrium feature that's similar to perfect competition in that in the long run there is zero profit. So that first feature is about the downward sloping demand curve that the individual firm faces in in monopolistic competition, as opposed to the horizontal one in perfect competition. That second feature is about the equilibrium. In the short run, the equilibrium profits are similar to a monopolist. You have this downward sloping marginal revenue curve. You find the intersection with the marginal cost curve. That gives you your quantity. You track that up to the price. And that means once we throw in the average total cost curve, there's a vertical distance at the equilibrium quantity between the price and the average total cost. As long as there's a vertical distance, which is that part of the dotted line between the marginal cost curve and the average total cost curve at at the price and average total cost curve at QE, that means we can end up with an area of profit, positive economic profits. So that's the short run feature that's similar to a monopoly. The long run feature that's similar to perfect competition is that demand curve keeps decreasing, which means the marginal revenue curve keeps decreasing, moving in towards the origin, which over time squeezes that vertical distance between price and average total cost until they are exactly equal. This comes about because of the entry of firms into the market, the entry of new firms seeking positive profits, a slice of the pie, until we end up with zero economic profits, and then there is no more firm entry and exit. So that zero long run economic profits is the feature that's similar to the equilibrium outcome of perfect competition. We also briefly spoke about the efficiency comparisons in the long run. So even though both monopolistic and perfect competition end up with zero economic profits per firm, at least in the case of perfect competition, we know that our firms are producing at the minimum of their average total cost curve, which from a societal point of view is an efficient allocation of society's resources. So we call that allocatively efficient. On the other hand, the process for the profits being squeezed in monopolistic competition lead to this excess capacity due to the fact that firms produce in long run equilibrium at a price that's above their average total cost. At an average total cost that is above their minimum average total cost. So overall, we could rearrange our firms, rearrange the quantities produced in such a way that would be more efficient. We'd get more production for a lower cost. So it's not allocatively efficient. Just a reasonably recent example about monopolistic competition. I mentioned cafes last time because every week I mention cafes. But the eyewear industry is another industry that is characterized by monopolistic competition. You probably know the main players, OPSM, Specsavers, and a few others in between. But just thinking, even just about those two, Optical Superstore spoke about Specsavers being extremely aggressive in their marketing. They even put savers as a term in their name. So they're really trying to differentiate themselves on price, on that discount element, as opposed to OPSM, something different, which is really trying to focus more on fashion. They usually run things like Dolce & Gabbana, Prada, Chanel, and so forth. So again, they're differentiating themselves on brand, potentially quality as well. Right, so we've got one last column in our market spectrum to look at, and that's oligopoly. And it's similar to monopoly, but instead of having one firm, we have a few. Not many, but a few. And they need to be large enough relative to the overall market to be able to influence the market price and therefore have some market power. And when there are only a few key players whose best actions or best business strategies depend on what the others are doing, then strategy really comes into play. And here I mean economic strategy. So people talk about business strategy all the time in terms of marketing and pricing and things like this. But what we've looked at so far has not captured strategy in its formal sense. So in economics, there are two types of problems in which people make choices. There are ones in which the optimality of the choice doesn't depend on what others are doing. And then there are those problems where how good your choice is depends on what others are doing. The first are just called decision problems in economics, such as games like Solitaire or Minesweeper, anything to do with just one player where you've got environmental conditions, even some uncertainty coming from known probabilities, but there aren't other players involved that you have to worry about. The same comes when we talk about minimizing costs or maximizing profit in perfect competition. You know that the others can't affect the price either. You can't affect the price. So you're really just maximizing profit, taking into account your own cost curves and the market demand or price. These environmental factors are just given to you, and then you do the best you can with them. In the case of Monopoly, of course, there are no other players you have to worry about. But in games like poker, chess, things like this, your best move depends on what the others are going to do, what you think they're going to do. Where you serve in tennis, to which corner you kick the ball for a soccer penalty kick, these sort of things. These are strategic problems. And in a business sense, oligopoly, market entry, price wars, these sort of things, it's critical to not only think about the factors that you are facing in making your decision, but also you need to know what the others are going to do. You need to be able to predict their choices, which means you need to think about what conditions they're facing as well. So what sort of markets are strategic? As I mentioned, it's not perfect competition because the actions of one agent by definition are not supposed to influence the others. It's not monopoly because they're the only actor. But we're thinking about situations where there is mutual independence of agents' actions. So that's our focus for today. It's about oligopoly. Like I said, it's a market structure featuring a small number of firms, and duo, meaning two, we've got duopoly as one of the most common, in which there are just two big firms. We can think about various oligopolies in Australia. In the concrete suppliers market, there's quite a lot actually in the natural resources industries as well. Road transport companies, cardboard manufacturers, Amcor and Vichy, and the retail grocery market used to be for a long time in Australia a duopoly between Coles and Woolworths. So for a long time this was the case. If we look at 2013, we can see that together Coles and Woolies had about 80% of the market share, with Aldi sitting in there only at 3%. Is it still a duopoly? Well, almost certainly not, and we can see how things have changed if we look at 2017. Both Coles and Woolworths have lost market share, and we can see that Aldi has made significant gains now at about 13%, overtaking IGA. There have been talks in the past 24 months about another German supermarket chain entering Australia. Actually, in Germany, Aldi is not considered a budget supermarket. It's more of an equivalent of a Woolworths. And there are other stores there, such as Lidl and Kaufland, that are more of the lower, I say lower quality, but more of those lower prices type goods. It made sense when Aldi entered the Australian market to try to set itself apart from Woolworths and Coles to capture market share. So instead of going in as a very similar competitor, it dropped itself a bit, trying to capture a different market, cheaper prices, having this fantastic middle aisle where you never know what you're going to find, but you know you're going to buy something. So then the market in Australia remained vulnerable to the introduction of other players. And if it was the case that a German budget supermarket like Kaufland entered Australia, I would predict that Aldi might actually try to go a bit more back to its roots, its current status in Germany, and actually increase its quality and the shopping experience a bit. But it doesn't look like, at least the latest news I heard, it doesn't look like that's going to happen now anytime soon. Okay, so in an oligopoly, firms have market power. There are strategic interactions in that the actions of one firm affect the actions of other firms. And most importantly, a firm needs to be able to guess, to forecast, to anticipate what other firms are about to do. And this is a branch of economics called game theory, a very popular branch, and there are a couple of courses at UQ devoted just to this. At second year level, there's 2070. There's also a more advanced course at third year and above, and 7070 at graduate level, which I teach. Okay, so let's take a simple example now, whether or not a firm should collude or to cheat against their partner. So collusion, you probably know, it's an arrangement between firms to fix the price. It can be done in different ways. The most well-known is done explicitly. Then you have so-called cartels. There's also tacit collusion, where there's no explicit arrangement, but it's sort of understood that the two firms refrain from competing against each other because they anticipate there might be consequences if they do so in terms of profit cutting. And then there's ones where people are price leaders, again, trying to avoid that sort of cutthroat competition. Now, what do I mean by cheating in this context? Well, I mean that at least one firm deviates from this sort of arrangement, whether it be explicit or implicit. And this incentive to cheat, to deviate from the arrangement, is what leads coalitions and cartels to generally being unstable, unable to be maintained in the long run. So let's look at collusion in the case of price fixing, which is illegal, but you know how things are. If firms A and B collude together, and they might do it, like I said, tacitly, but here let's just imagine they come up with an agreement between the two of them. They can maximize profit if they work together. They can do this by getting together and say, hey, let's just act as if we were one firm with all the market power. If we were just one firm, we kind of know what they would do. They would act in terms of being a monopolist if there's just one firm. So we can combine their marginal cost curves, look at the market demand curve, do our usual profit maximization method of setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, find where that sits on the demand curve, find the price, find the profits. The profits here make up that large rectangle. So we can do that, and then we can say, okay, let's produce half each. So the profit maximizing quantity for a monopolist is 8 units. let's say firm A produces the first 4, firm B produces the next 4, and you can do the calculations. Here I've just put a marginal cost that's fixed at $25 per unit, and you can find that both firms get profits of $180. And we can divide up the graph like this so that we can consider it from the individual firm perspective. And if they stick to this, they do quite well. Notice that they are not actually setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue from their own individual point of view, because the two firms are not independent of each other. And there are many examples of this. Perhaps the most famous you've heard about has to do with OPEC, the petrol sort of organization made up of a few member countries, mainly in the Middle East. And we can see periods when they could cooperate together and stick to that cooperation, and then periods when external factors happen that sort of broke their explicit agreements with each other, broke that sense of trust. Now, what factors can affect that sense of trust? Well, if your cartel is supported by your own government, for example, then that's going to already give some incentives to stick to the cartel. If you've got, say, tacit governmental approval, for example, it might be strictly illegal or legally illegal, but good for the country in terms of growth, and the government might turn a blind eye. So what we can see is that, say, in the late 70s, there was a fair bit of cooperation going on, and high oil prices started through actions by OPEC. But then the revolution in Iran saw the cartel break, and the price actually plummet. And the cartel resumed again, but then other things happened that reduced the price of oil once more. So we can see some correlation between the oil price and external factors that might influence the ability of that cooperation to be maintained. And I've got a little bit more information that you can check about this. So if we go to the final point that I put on that graph back in 2015, then we saw more competition actually being applied to the market from outside. In particular, the production of shale oil in the US. And that extra competition from outside reduced the market power from inside. And by reducing the market power, it also reduces the gains from cooperation, which starts to make deviating from that cartel cooperation. It makes those deviations more profitable. In other words, cheating becomes more profitable, and we saw that the cartel collapsed once again. So let's see how this cheating works in our example of firm A and firm B. We had them before earning profits of 180 each. And now let's see whether there's any incentive for firms to deviate. So suppose firm A cheats and chooses a lower price. Actually, instead of 70, chooses a price of 60. Well, by choosing a price of 60, it can increase its output from 4 to 6 units. And those 6 units will be the first ones sold because they're the cheapest ones around, so demand will go there first. That's going to increase firm A's profit now to 210. It used to be 180. Now, if B isn't aware of this and sticks to the agreement of trying to produce 4, well, it's not actually and produces 4 at a price of 70, it's going to end up only selling 2 and lead to a lower profit of 40, which you can see over my shoulder there. So let's see how this works. This is going to be an increase in profit by reducing to 60 and now selling 6. Now at a price of 60, and put that up, the demand curve that firm B now faces is actually moved in more, which means that selling at 70, only 2 will be able to be sold now when we consider the market demand. And that's because the demand curve that firm B faces depends on the actions of firm A. So that's going to lead to a much lower profit for firm B. So what should firm B do in this situation? Well, the incentive for firm B is to lower its price. So it will lower its price and increase its output, and it might even try to undercut firm A. And then what's firm A going to be? Well, firm A is going to try to cheat as well, and theoretically we could have a price war that continues until they're not making any profit at all, both producing an amount of 16 at the marginal cost. And that would actually lead to our perfectly competitive output in which both firms are producing 0. Now, this doesn't seem quite right. I mean, they've got market power. There's only 2 of them, and yet we've ended up in the perfectly competitive equilibrium output with 0 profit. Well, there are other ways to analyze an oligopoly, and generally speaking, we find that in equilibrium for a duopoly or an oligopoly, they do make some positive economic profits. Collectively, they produce more than a monopolist, and we just saw why. There's an incentive to cheat at a lower price than a monopolist because of a little bit of undercutting. So this actually reduces the deadweight loss, but it doesn't go all the way to the point of producing 0. There's still an equilibrium point where the quantity supplied is still less than the deadweight, than the perfectly competitive output, so there is still a deadweight loss. So we can already see the makings of a dilemma for firms in these sort of markets. Cheating and collusion present a trade-off in the actions. And I reiterate once again that the best decision therefore depends on anticipating what other firms are about to do. This branch of economics called game theory models these strategic interactions, so strategic behavior by agents who are also assumed to know that their actions affect others and vice versa. And even though this is a branch of economics, it's very widely used in political science. Many of the management consultancies adopt it quite often. Also used in sociology and even biology when studying the behavior of different organisms, even at the microorganism level. In fact, its applications are wide-ranging. Game theory economists have been employed as consultants for football companies, different sporting companies. For example, Chelsea hired a game theorist as a consultant for the 2008 Champions League final with Manchester United. Ask me more about that if you want to know. But within our applications, we can think about not just oligopolies, but also auctions and negotiations. Things like how to deal with the externalities in climate change, particularly at the intergovernment sort of level. Defense, military strategies, and anything to do with international relations. Also, a lot of different sporting applications, such as how to prevent doping and steroid abuse. A lot of stuff within political science and social norms within communities. Let's look at a simple example to get you thinking. Imagine I've invented a game called the grade game, and we decide in these troubled times that the best way to allocate your grade is to be done via this game. So what happens is, during the exam week, you are told that you are randomly paired with another student in the class, and you have to make a choice, alpha or beta. So you click the button, submit your choice, And both your choice and your partner's choice determines both of your grades. Let me show you how we can write this in a payoff matrix to demonstrate how these grades are determined. If you choose alpha and your partner chooses alpha, you end up with 5. So that's the top left corner there. If you choose alpha and your partner chooses beta, you get a 7. That's the box in the top left corner, top right cell. Excuse me. Just realized I can put a laser pointer on here. That's going to make life much easier. If you choose beta and they choose alpha, you get 4. And if you choose beta and they choose beta, you get 6. Now, your partner's payoffs are on the right here, and we care about your partner's payoffs as well, because you need them to get an idea of what you think your partner will do. And they are exactly the same as your payoffs, but just in reverse. So here, we've always got your choice. So if you choose beta and they choose alpha, they get a 7. In the same way that if you choose alpha and they choose beta, you get a 7. So what I'm going to do now is to simplify this payoff table by taking their choices and merging them with our payoffs. We'll do that as follows. So all I've done now is basically squish the two tables together. So for example, if we choose alpha and they choose beta, we get a 7 and they get a 4. So just what we saw on the previous page. We choose alpha, they choose beta, we get a 7. We choose alpha, they choose beta, they get a 4. And that's what we've done by just squishing them all together. Okay, so I want you to think about this now. I'll put up the matrix again. Remember, the first number is your payoff. The second number is their payoff. Your choice is just between alpha and beta. So have a think about it and come up with what your choice would be and why. Pause the video now. Well, when I've done this in different classes, we usually get a mix, about 50-50 in the population choosing each. And the reasons are quite interesting. There's no right or wrong answer because it's your decision, it's your thinking that goes behind it. But I will mention that one choice is theoretically preferable to another. So if you only care about your grade, then you should choose alpha. If you care about someone else's grade, about issues of fairness, equality, what's best for the class, things like that, then you might prefer beta. But if you are selfish, you should choose alpha. And in fact, most of the students who chose alpha gave that as their reason. They only spoke about if I, and then I would get, and then I would get. Whereas people who chose beta spoke about things like, if I and my partner choose the same thing, then 6-6 is better than 5-5. So people who chose beta tended to talk about the other person's payoffs as well, as in that's something that they would also care about. Which is why you find more people in, say, the psychology classes choosing beta than in the MBA cohort, where you mainly get people choosing alpha. And the people choosing alpha might say things like, well, if my partner chooses alpha, then my payoff would be better if I choose alpha. And if my partner chooses beta, then my payoff is better if I choose alpha. So alpha seems to be the best no matter what. Another argument given is about avoiding the worst case scenario, avoid 4 at all costs. But we'll see that that is not actually a very strong reason in this case. Okay, why do we care about this grade game that I've just made up? Well, let's look at a very simple but realistic example. Imagine that you've got a simple, similar game with two petrol stations in one town, Caltex and BP. They're the only ones there, and they have to work out whether or not to charge a high price or a low price. Now, of course, they could charge prices in between, but essentially high or low gives the general sort of area that they're going to set their prices at. Well, if they both set high prices, they can both split the market and both make profits of 16 whatever, it doesn't matter, $16,000 a week, let's say. If they both set low prices, they again split the market, but now they're making less profit to split, so they're both getting 8. If BHP sets a high price, but Caltex sets a low price, then Caltex gets a much larger share of the market, and they can extract a profit of 30 by dominating the market, just like we saw that firm A could make more profit by undercutting firm B in our earlier example. And BHP will only be able to squeeze a profit of 5 out. Likewise, if BHP sets the low price and Caltex sets the high price, then those payoffs are flipped. Now note that these values here talk about the payoffs. So it could be profit, it could be revenue. I think in this case I made it revenue, but it doesn't matter. But these are not prices, these are the payoffs of the game. You can think about it in terms of utility if you want. Now let's put ourselves in the shoes of BHP, and BHP needs to think about what the other player would do. That's the whole point behind strategic interactions. So BHP thinks about what Caltex will do. If Caltex sets a high price, then BHP's choice now is between high or low, or in other words, payoffs of 30 versus 16. Well, 30 sounds pretty good. So BHP would set a low price. What if Caltex sets a low price? Well, then it's payoffs between 8 and 5. 8's better than 5. So BHP sets a low price. In both cases, BHP sets a low price. Just as in the grade game, choosing alpha is always the better choice if you care only about your own grade. So here we would say that low price is a dominant strategy. But everything's symmetric in the game, so we can assume that Caltex is thinking exactly the same way. If Caltex is thinking the same way, then low is also a dominant strategy. This means that both of them will choose low, and the outcome we get is 8-8. This is known as the Nash equilibrium, and 8-8 is what we would expect to happen and we would forecast to happen, even though it is strictly worse for both of them than if they could somehow cooperate and both set high prices. However, low is the dominant strategy for both firms, and a dominant strategy is a strategy that's preferred by the player regardless of what the other person does. So in every possible scenario, whatever the other player chooses, it's still our best choice. Now the grade game and the BHP Caltech example are both different context for the same sort of game, which you probably have heard about somewhere before. It's called the Prisoner's Dilemma, and it's one of the most famous and important games in game theory, in economics, and in various other disciplines that apply game theory in some sense. It looks a little bit like this. You've got two prisoners, prisoner A and prisoner B, who've been caught for a robbery. Now, if one of them confesses, there's enough evidence to charge them for robbery and put them away for a long period of time. If not, they can only be charged for some minor misdemeanor, say trespassing, and they'll both get they'll both only get 1 year in jail in that case. And this, so basically what happens is the detectives take the two prisoners, put them in two separate rooms and say, confess, and we'll give you a good deal. If you confess and the other person doesn't confess, then guess what? You go for free. And this is basically the policing technique used in every NCIS episode or CSI episode ever, I think. So if they both remain silent, they'll only get 1 year each. If they both confess, they get 5 years each. But the real issue is that if one of them confesses and the other one stays silent, the one who confesses gets out for free and the other one gets 20 years in jail. So what actually happens here, it's exactly the same sort of setup that we've seen in the other games. There is one equilibrium outcome because of the dominant strategies. Let's look at these dominant strategies. If player B confesses, the choice between player A is between getting 5 years by confessing or 20 years if they remain silent. Better to take the 5-year sentence, so they'll confess. If player B remains silent, the choice is between 1 year in jail or going out for free. Better to go out, be free. So player A confesses. We've got two dominant strategies for player A and player B. They both confess. They both end up worse than they would have. Now, this possibility of strategic interactions means that just going for profit maximization no longer leads to the socially optimal allocation of resources. So when we looked at perfect competition, this was the grand claim by Adam Smith, which is also used on the right side of politics quite a lot, which is this idea that without any intervention by anyone, just leaving the firms and the individuals, consumers, but mainly the firms, to act in their own selfish, self-interested way, will somehow magically, through the invisible hand, so through the price mechanism, will lead to the most efficient outcome, the socially optimal allocation with maximizing surplus. But what we can see is that that actually doesn't happen if there are strategic interactions. Now, this prisoner's dilemma is seen in many different examples in the real world, such as should countries cut emissions or not? Maybe all countries would prefer a world where their production is greener and emissions are cut. But if just one country, say the US, says we're not going to stick to the agreement, we're going to let our firms produce more, then that country does quite well because most of the world is greener, pollution goes down, and they can make a small contribution to pollution but reap huge profits by having cheaper production. So they have a competitive advantage on the world market. The other countries see this, well, they're not going to stand for this, so they then give up on their emission targets, and overall we end up in a world where there's the same level of fierce competition amongst countries but more pollution everywhere. The same thing goes when it comes to the proliferation of armaments, such as the stockpile of nuclear weapons. I think all countries would prefer if nuclear weapons didn't exist in any capacity, but obviously there are a lot of resources and a lot of risk that goes into countries having nuclear weapons. You don't want to be a country without them if another country has them, who is your rival and enemy, and you would prefer to be that country with them with nobody else having any. It's still a dilemma in the sense that we end up with everyone arming themselves. And the same goes for any situation where it's a negative sum game, in that you compete with other firms and you have to put more costs into play just to stay competitive, such as advertising in business, whether or not you hire lawyers when going through a divorce, whether or not you should dope if you are a professional athlete, and then many other examples that you might think about that have happened in recent times as well, such as runs on the supermarket, toilet paper, any of these examples, situations where we would prefer that everyone just bought what they needed when they needed it, but seeing as everybody else is buying them, then we may as well buy them. Some work that I do in Somalia is about the practice of female circumcision, which is another social dilemma. Okay, let's look at a game now involving cartels. So cartels, remember, they represent private agreements by its members aimed at increasing the profit overall by reducing competition in the market. such as trying to act like a monopolist, controlling prices. Now, while they are illegal, they still happen from time to time, even though they cannot write enforceable contracts, and they can't do this because they are illegal. Therefore, they can just make promises to each other, but of course, these promises are not credible. They're not legally enforceable. This can also lead to a prisoner's dilemma type of scenario. For example, imagine a situation like this where a firm has to decide whether or not to cut its prices or not cut its prices. Now, firm A might say to firm B, don't cut your prices, I won't cut my prices. We can both keep them high. Our consumers choose between us 50-50. We make big profits here, 200-200. But there's that incentive to deviate. If firm B is not cutting its prices and we do, we can increase our profits to 300. But once we're at 300 and firm B is at 100, now there's a new incentive to move from there, with firm B now price cutting, and we end up at 150. So this is the realized outcome. But remember, we talked about Pareto efficiency, and this goes to this idea that Adam Smith's principle is not captured by the efficiency of perfect competition through Adam Smith's invisible hand is not captured when there are strategic interactions. Because is there a way that we could make both firms better off without one being worse off? Well, there's an outcome here, 200-200, which is Pareto optimal. However, the realized outcome is not Pareto optimal and is also called the Nash equilibrium. You might have heard about the Nash equilibrium, or this name, Nash. That's any situation where both firms can't do any better individually. So individually, there's no deviation that improves the situation for one firm. So they're playing the best that they can do when considering what the others are doing. And in such an equilibrium, like I said, no player has any incentive to deviate. But who's Nash? Well, one big difference between Nash and what economics had beforehand is that idea that we should not think about equilibrium in terms of the result of individual ambition serving the common good, striving for their best outcome, but just a situation where firms can't do any better considering what the others are doing. And it was a relatively recent concept, actually the 1950s compared to Adam Smith in the late 1700s. It's now considered by far to be the most common solution concept for any sort of situation involving strategic interactions, including business case studies. And John Nash has assigned his name to it. He was immortalized by Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind. Fantastic movie if you haven't already seen it. It also gives a sense of the somewhat dramatic and traumatic life that he had. He died in 2015. He was actually planning to be a mathematician originally, and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in the late 90s. And what I'll do for you now is just show you one of the famous scenes from the movie where John Nash, who is sort of also autistic, comes up with his brilliant idea for the Nash equilibrium. And of course it's Hollywoodized, but take into account what Russell Crowe says about Adam Smith. Adam Smith's theory, in this case with relation to how him and his friends can approach a group of girls, and particularly this difference in the concept of Nash equilibrium, in that what everybody does selfishly may not end up in the common good. Okay, so let me see if I can work this out, and we'll watch the famous scene. Here we go.
Morning, gentlemen.
Deep breaths. Nash, you might want to stop shuffling your papers for 5 seconds.
I will not buy you gentlemen beer.
Oh, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Oh. Does anyone else feel she should be moving in slow motion?
Will she want a large wedding, you think?
Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn?
Have you remembered nothing? Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, the father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good.
Exactly.
Every man for himself, gentlemen.
And those who strike out are stuck with their friends.
I'm not gonna strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make a drink.
I don't think he said that.
All right, nobody move. She's looking over here. Right, she's looking at Nash.
Oh, God. All right, he may have the upper hand now, but wait until he opens his mouth. Remember the last time?
Oh, yes, that was in the history books.
Adam Smith needs revision.
What are you talking about?
If we all go for the blonde, we block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way, and we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid. Adam Smith said, the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, that's right? Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay? Because the best result would come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group.
Ash, this is some way for you to get the blonde on your own. You can go to hell. Governing dynamics, gentlemen. Governing dynamics. Adam Smith. What's wrong with you?
Yep, here we go.
Careful, careful.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it was another time, shall we say, back then. But the point, I hope, is reasonably clear, and it is a good movie, worth watching, and you can say it's vaguely related to your studies. So credibility is a big issue within the prisoner's dilemma, as we have seen. A prisoner can promise to his fellow conspirator that he won't confess, just like a firm in a cartel can promise that it will stick to the agreed quantity. But these promises are not credible because they're usually not enforceable. So how can players prove their credibility? Well, let's look at a completely different example. One of the nice things about game theory, by the way, is that we can illustrate the concepts in quite fun ways, I think. So let's look at a warfare example now, medieval warfare. We've got two countries, country A and country B, and they can choose. So country A has got an army that's coming to invade country B. Country A's got boats ready for a naval attack. Country B has a castle on the island and then lives over here. There's a bridge. So country A has got two choices. Can launch a strong attack on the island, investing all of its forces, or it can do nothing. A country B can choose to defend against this or retreat. So this seems like a bit of a quirky example. We've actually seen it many times throughout history though, and is also relevant to politics today, as we'll see. How can we analyze this basic situation? Well, country A would rather do nothing than go to war. A fight is expensive and damaging for A, but it's also damaging for B. And A knows that if attacked, B probably prefers to retreat. So in equilibrium, if you analyze this, country A will attack, knowing that B will retreat. It's B's best option, and A takes the spoils. So then the question is, what can B do to prevent being attacked? B needs to credibly signal that they will fight back. Now they can bluff, for example. Maybe they're going to send a messenger to say that we definitely want to fight back. But that's not credible. A can call that bluff. There is a very simple solution, given all the information that you have on this slide, on this diagram, that country B can do in order to credibly signal that country B will attack and put off country A from attacking in the first place and giving a much better outcome for country B. Have a think about it, be creative, see what you come up with. Pause the video now. Well, there have been several interesting historical examples of this situation. One of these famous ones was actually during the Diocletian era of the Roman Empire, when the Romans invaded Britain, which is why the English language has so many Latin roots. There was a general whose name I have forgotten, who I think it was Julius, actually, not Julius Caesar, but another, but history is not my strong point. They landed on the coast of Britain and realized there was a larger army of natives than they expected. They were hoping the natives would just basically give in and accept being subjects of the Roman Empire, like many other tribes had done during their conquest of Europe. But instead they realized there was going to be resistance, there was going to be a bloody and damaging war. So what the general did was he burnt the ships. He told his men to burn the ships in a massive bonfire, which had a couple of other, a couple of advantages. The first was it signaled to his own men, we can't retreat now. We can't go back across to France, which means you better fight for your lives as hard as you can, rather than putting in, say, 50% in the hope that you're still alive for the retreat. There will be no retreat. It also sent a very big, smoky signal to the Britons saying, if you want to fight, we're fighting to the death. Otherwise, you can capitulate now and let us rule you, which worked, actually. So this is exactly what country B could do in our example. Country B could burn the bridge. Now, there is no choice for country B but to defend against a strong attack by fighting back. And we know that A would rather do nothing than go to such a war. So A will not attack, and B actually rules the day, gets a better result than would have. And it's related also in part to the famous book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, who says that when you're on the attack and you surround an army, leave them an outlet, leave them a way to go out free, don't press too desperately, and that way you'll get a more advantageous result. Now, the Nobel Prize winner Thomas Schelling called this sort of approach madman theory when it comes to politics. And in the past year or two, both Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un have been connected to this madman strategy, not used here as an insult, but just as in they quite often say things where they make claims that they are willing to go to these completely crazy, devastating lengths if their demands are not met, such as Trump's trade war, many other things that Trump has said, and Kim Jong-un's approach to, say, nuclear warfare. An interesting example was last year when we think about when Boris Johnson, as soon as he became the Prime Minister in Great Britain, he suspended the Parliament just in the lead up to a critical deadline in the Brexit negotiations. His Parliament had been trying for some time with Theresa May to try and pass the Brexit bill. It kept getting voted down over and over again. We had a situation where Boris could propose either a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, and the MPs could decide in Parliament whether to fight back or whether to concede and give in to what he wanted. Now, the MPs didn't want a hard Brexit. Boris wanted a hard Brexit. If he proposed a let's start with if he proposed a soft Brexit. If he proposed a soft Brexit, he would get a payoff, let's say a payoff of 1. And the MPs would get a payoff of 1, sort of an intermediate sort of outcome. If they were fighting back. So they're both fighting, it's not too great for either of them. The best outcome from the perspective of Boris was a hard Brexit. So that's when he proposes a hard Brexit and the MPs concede and give in to that. But that's not good for the MCs. Their best outcome would have been a situation with there was a soft Brexit. Then they would be prepared to concede and get a payoff of 2. But this isn't what Boris wanted. And you can see when you add up the 2 payoffs of Boris and of the MPs, that's not fighting back, not prolonging these negotiations and pushing them closer to the no deal scenario is definitely in everyone's best interest. So you can see the payoffs on the right hand side here are typically better than those equivalent ones where there's a fight going on. But if we try to solve for Nash equilibrium in this game, that is a situation in which both the players, here Boris versus the MPs, are happy and have no incentive to deviate, we see that we cannot find the right solution. So for example, if the MPs decide they're going to fight whatever Boris proposed, then his choice is between hard or soft Brexit, 0 or 1 for Boris. So he may as well choose soft Brexit. That's the best for him. So we can put a circle around that one. And essentially we're looking to see if we can find a box where there are circles around both numbers, the number for Boris and the number for the MPs. If we find such a box, then the 2 players are playing the best response to each other and we have a Nash equilibrium. So what happens if the MPs choose to concede? Again, if we want to find Boris's best response, we need to put ourselves inside the mindset of the other player first. So if the other player, the MPs, concede, the choice for Boris is between hard or soft Brexit and the payoffs are 2 or 1. Well, 2 is better than 1, so we circle the 2, and that's the best response for Boris if the MPs concede. Now, what about the best responses for the MPs? Well, then we put ourselves in the mind of Boris first. If Boris does a hard Brexit, the MP's choice is between getting a 1 for fighting it or a 0 to concede. So 1 is better. We put a circle around that. And if Boris proposes a soft Brexit, well, now the MPs would prefer to concede to it. 2 beats 1, so we put a circle around that. But none of the boxes have 2 circles. In no situation do we reach an equilibrium. There is always an incentive for one of the 2 parties to deviate and cheat the other one. And that's probably, roughly speaking, why the negotiations took so long. Everyone always had an incentive to try to push a little bit harder in some direction. So what did our esteemed leader do? Well, he actually took Thomas Schelling's theory to its natural consequence. He suspended the parliament. Basically, he burned his option to change to soft. He had already proposed hard, and by suspending the parliament, he basically said to the MPs, if you fight this, I'm not going to change my mind. In fact, we are now stuck in a very bad situation. I'm essentially burning the bridge. So one way we can see this in terms of the payoffs is to actually rule out that soft Brexit argument and say, if the MPs fight hard Brexit, the payoffs get much worse for both sides. We end up with a no deal scenario, which means, for example, negative payoffs for both sides. Even if they're worse for Boris, being the leader of a country going into no deal would be political suicide. Still, the point is he makes his opponent's payoff for fighting worse now than his opponent's payoff for conceding, and by ruling out one of his own options. Now the choice just sits with the MPs. They can fight and get -1, they concede and get 0, and we end up in basically one Nash equilibrium that is a better outcome than Boris could have dreamed about at the start. So hard Brexit wins the day. Okay, so we've seen a number of examples with firms, with prisoners, with politicians, with army generals. It's always about the idea of working out the best responses of both agents and then seeing when they match up with each other, because that gives us a situation where we have a Nash equilibrium, meaning that no side has an incentive to deviate. And to work out the best response for a given player, you need to always think about what the other person is going to do. So a key skill from game theory is thinking in someone else's shoes. Now, game theory is such a large topic. Like I said, there are several courses within the School of Economics just devoted to it, that I can't do it justice in this lecture. But given that we've gone through so many examples crammed into one lecture, I thought we might have a little bit of fun for the rest of this lecture. So what follows now is not examinable, I'll tell you up front. It's just a bit of fun to give you a bit more exposure to game theory and to help you get a few other skills from this field and maybe whet your appetite a little bit. So we'll do one example and then we'll play one game where you can actually submit your choices to Blackboard. So the first example, I'm going to call this game the 21 game. Aren't I creative? The grade game and the 21 game. The 21 game, some of you might sort of get a memory jog when you see the rules. There are two players, white and black, or actually let's call them player 1 and player 2. Player 1 and player 2 is a bit easier. There are 21 objects in a pile. Matchsticks, coins, doesn't matter. Players alternate taking turns to grab an object from the pile. So player 1 goes first, then player 2, then player 3, and so forth. Now when it's your turn, you can take 1, 2, or 3 objects from the pile. That's your choice, 1, 2, or 3. And the winner is the player who takes the last object. That's it. So if you're watching at home and you've got a housemate there or someone else, or you're chatting to a friend online, why don't you play this game now before we go any further? Just think about what you'll do. Just try it a few times. See if you can come up with some idea of a good strategy, some sort of winning patterns for you. So have a go at that now. Pause the video and then we will discuss it. Okay, so usually when we do this in a lecture, I actually make it quite interactive. We get 2 students up to play it and then we see how they go. Then we get 2 more students, then 2 more, then we discuss and things like this. This semester I've had to improvise a little bit, so I'm going to play against someone. And I'll do it on screen for you. Let's see if I can work this out. What I'll do is I'll move me over here and I'll play against some opponents. Okay, let's see how we go. So we're starting with 21 and we'll let Brittany go first. Okay, Brittany, take it away. Brittany's taking 1, it seems. Strong opening play. So we're going from 21 down to 20. Okay, so my turn. I'll take 1. So we're on 19 now.
I'll take 2.
All right, Lara Croft, you take 2. So we're down to 17. I will take 1, and we're down to 16.
One more thing.
Amen.
Columbo's taking 1. We're down to 15. So I'll take 3, and we're down to 12.
Take a 3-man. Holla!
Okay, Crazy Robot Lady taking 3, down to 9. I'll take 1. We're on 8 now.
I'll take 2 chickens.
All right, a little ominous from the Hound, but he's taking 2 chickens, bringing us to 6. I'll now take 2, bringing us to 4. Feeling pretty good about this. Last player.
That still only counts as 1.
Oh, Gimli taking 1, but that means I can take 3, and I've got to 0. I've won. So I've defeated my Hollywood opponents. Well done, me. Let me rearrange things somewhat so that I don't leave this particular scene up for the rest of the lecture. So I won. I beat Hollywood. Now this game, some of you might know, is called NIM. And the key to solving it is using a technique that we use quite often in game theory called backward induction, sometimes also known as a rollback equilibrium. And the general idea is that you start at the potential end of the game, work out what each player would do, find each player's best response, and gradually work from the very end of the game all the way towards the start. So if you haven't already worked out my strategy and how I won, have a think about it now and try to work out who wins in NIM, the first player or the second player. Who should always win? Maybe write it down, see how you go, pause your video now. Well, let's see how I beat the team, how I beat Hollywood. When there are 21 objects, we know that a player wins if it's his turn to move and there are just 1, 2, or 3 objects left. Remember, we're going right to the end where there's only a few left and working our way back. So that means that if a player has 4 objects left, they will lose for sure, because whatever choice you take, 1, 2, or 3, will leave the other person the chance to take whatever's left. So you don't want to end up with 4. But if you don't want to end up with 4, that means that if I've got 5, 6, or 7 left when it's my turn, I can get you to 4. If there are 5 left, I'll take 1. If there are 6 left, I'll take 2. If there are 7 left, I'll take 3. I'll get you to 4, and then we know that you lose. So if I win, if there are 5, 6, or 7 left, then you must lose if there are 8 left, because whatever you choose when there are 8 left, it'll be my turn with 5, 6, or 7 left. So 4 is a losing number, 8 is a losing number. If you keep going, you'll see that 12 is a losing number, 16 is a losing number when it's your turn to move. Anything where there's a multiple of 4. So 20 is a losing number. And actually, Brittany chose very well. She said, hit me one more time, took us from 21 to 20, and that's the right play. I then chose 1, took us to 19, and then Tomb Raider Lara Croft should have chosen 3 to get me to 16. Remember, multiples of 4 are bad. As soon as she chose 2, I chose 1, and that got me to it being Hollywood's move at a multiple of 4. Then it didn't matter after that, as long as I kept them at a multiple of 4. Columbo chose 1, so I chose 3. Futurama robot chose 3, I chose 1, the Hound chose 2, I chose 2, and then Gimli didn't have anything that he could do. Right at the end, I was going to win. Now this seems like a rather trivial game, although it's been studied intensely by mathematicians, computer programmers, and economists. It's just a simple, fun example of how you need to think about what the other player will do, and introducing this concept of backward induction. Go to the end and work your way back. So now it's your turn. We can play a game that we'll do on Blackboard. Again, I'm very creative with my naming of games. So this one's the guessing game, and the game is quite simple. So you and every other student in Econ 1011 who plays this game should submit one number. It can be any number from 0 to 100, 0, 1, 2, 3. It must be a whole number, an integer. Then I'm going to take the average of all the guesses, and the winner of the game is the student who guesses the closest to 2/3 of the average. So if everyone chooses 100, then the winner is the closest to 67. Okay? If there's a tie, we'll do a random tiebreaker. And this is how you can play. So go to Blackboard, go to week 8. There's a survey there called the guessing game. Pretty simple. You just have to put in one number, a guess, and your student number, and click submit. And there'll be a small prize for the winner. You've got until Monday, 4th of May in the morning to submit your answer. Good luck. Once you've submitted, you can also try to think about what the Nash equilibrium of this game is and whether or not you played that way, and if you didn't, why or why not. I'm interested in your thoughts. Feel free to discuss it, chat in the discussion board if you want. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I do think game theory is a very cool field. This is all that we'll cover in this course. Next week, we start moving on into the macro field. Thanks for listening. Bye.